we'll make a start if that's all right with you. So Katie and I were just having this little chat beforehand, and my introduction to Katie was reading her 2017 paper on, I can't even remember what it was called, messy building complex, messy program theory, something about that, isn't it? Something about that, I think, is the actual is the name. And I can remember reading it, and Katie had used an existing framework in which to construct her IPTs. And I used a framework in my PhD, and I just suddenly felt like I had all this legitimacy and permission to keep going because somebody else had done it and written about it. And I think I probably did reference you in my PhD as well. So there you go. So, Dr. Katie Shearn works in the School of Health and Social Care, Sheffield Hallam University, and is the theme lead for transforming places for health and wellbeing at the Advanced Wellbeing Research Centre. Katie's interests are in public health, particularly in government initiatives around neighbourhood approaches to sustain healthier lives. She looks at health and well-being beyond individual decision-making and focuses on understanding how complex social systems shape health inequalities. This includes research and evaluation, which supports organisations, partnerships, and policy actors to design, implement, and evaluate interventions that work with rather than against system dynamics. Drawing on a background in psychology and public health, Katie is the principal investigator within the National Evaluation and Learning Partnership, supporting Sport England's system-led investment programmes. Dr. Shearn has expertise in developmental evaluation, realist approaches, including realist interviewing and realist synthesis, and methods for making sense of uncertainty within dynamic multi-agency systems. She is committed to participatory and relational approaches that centre lived experience, partnership working, and local learning. And across her projects, she works closely with practitioners, communities, and policymakers to build capacity for systems thinking and adaptive learning cultures. Gosh, Katie, that's like enormous, isn't it?
Oh, I wrote that, and now I'm feeling
Yeah.
a little bit
Yeah,
like...
that's there's a lot of words to fall over then, so I really had to slow down as well. Otherwise, it would have just come out as one giant. Blah, 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 blah. But yeah,
All
that
of that
sounds
is very true,
fantastic.
though. That's me.
It is, yeah.
That also is Becky.
So I'm hoping that we get a good insight into a lot of this work that you're doing at the moment.
Yeah.
And if anyone's got any questions about any of the things that we just mentioned in the bio, please follow up with Katie separately. And I'm sure you've got your email on your slides, but if not, we can certainly pop that in the chat for everybody as well.
Thank you, Jo. And thanks, everybody. Shall I just get started?
Yes, please. So I'll just mention before we get going, if you've got any questions as Katie is speaking, pop them in the chat and we'll come to you in turn at the very end. That's all right. Perfect.
Thanks, Jo. Thanks, everybody.
Yours.
Great to see everybody. Thanks so much. I can see that people are going off camera, which is absolutely fine, and your prerogative. Sometimes it's useful for me to see some faces so that I know whether people are following along. So if you don't mind and you are okay to have your camera on and in the video chat, then that's great. Eleanor, Eleanor's my PhD student, so I feel like she had to do that, but that's great. Thank you.
No pressure, Eleanor, no pressure. Smiley face all the way through.
Nodding and smiling. But that's awesome. Thanks, everybody. So as Jo said, yes, I'm Katie, and for a long time I've been really thinking about realist approaches, but very much in the context of complex systems. And I absolutely know that probably a lot of you here coming from with an interest in realist approaches will think that, well, realist approaches is really designed to deal with complexity, as we'll talk about. But I just want to kind of really explore what that means when we think about actually large-scale programs, as Jo referenced my 2017 paper, in complex settings as well. So I'm going to share my screen. I think that the presentation is going to last around 40 minutes or so. I'm really happy for you to ask questions in the chat. If there's any points where people are unsure and it lacks clarity with what I've actually said, then I've just given Jo permission to interrupt me, just so that we don't go too far without people really following along with what I'm saying. But hopefully it's pitched at a level which is understandable for you. So Jo, can you give me a wave if that's showing my slides now? Super. So what we're going to cover today is thinking about complexity and actually thinking about some of the critiques that we've had from outside the realist camp, as it were, that whilst realist evaluation and synthesis might be theoretically aligned with complexity, there is a tendency to simplify things empirically. So how I'm going to structure this presentation is, first of all, to revisit and bring people into the mindset of what do we mean when we think about complexity and what have been the realist responses to this to date. Thinking about where is that critique coming from and how do we make sense of that? And then just some general tips and things to think about avoiding in your own work to avoid that critique if that's what you're trying to do. I'm then going to bring to light some of the work that myself and also Kev, who's on the call, has been engaged with for a number of years now, which is about whole systems change, and introduce to you the way in which we have used a realist method alongside other kind of approaches to try to really honour the idea that systems are complex and that we don't have any definitive truths, but that we can build and accumulate knowledge around middle range theory in particular. And so I'm going to take you through an approach that we use there. I've labelled this as work in progress. It always will be work in progress. I think that's one of the key messages, that we're never going to get this absolutely right, and nor should we, because we're working in complexity. And to that end, I'll end the presentation with just a few things of challenges that we've faced and also potential areas that we as a realist community can address. So I'm going to move on to, first of all, revisiting complexity. So again, it's something that I think we all inherently understand, that the world is complex and that social systems are complex, but sometimes we don't necessarily think through what does that really mean. And so one plug to begin with is for a series of slides that curated. They're curated fairly uncritically, I'd say, but they're curated by Diane Finegood and then and then presented in a collection of slides called the Frameworks Collection. Hopefully Lauren's putting the links into the chat here, that actually help people to lean into and understand, but in these kind of really lovely graphic, cartoony kind of forms, what we mean by complexity and the different frameworks that are out there and things that you can reference. So it's not specifically realist, it's more about complexity and systems thinking, but if that's your bag and that's what you're interested in, then I would certainly go and have a look at that. But what we're talking about when we talk about complexity really is recognizing that things are unpredictable, they're dynamic, they adapt over time, that there isn't any central control, that they're non-linear, which means that you have disproportionate effects. So a small input could lead to a large output, and so on and so forth, and that elements that are interdependent. So I'm just going to bring that to life with a little analogy of thinking about a garden. You know, if we think about a garden and we think about emergence, then what are we actually saying? Well, we're saying that, you know, it's not the properties of the garden isn't necessarily reducible to its constituent parts. So, for example, if we were to plant two plants side by side that might be considered companion plants and they have beneficial effects on each other, that isn't just reducible to the characteristics of that plant. It's something to do with the two together, which brings about that property of reducing kind of, you know, maybe it's pest control or something like that. The second element to sort of think about is that dynamism. So, you know, things are changing over time. Things are not necessarily the same. And, you know, if you think about a garden over seasons, you know, this wouldn't look the same, would it, in autumn or winter than it does obviously in the height of summer today. What do we mean by self-organizing? So the fact that there's no central control. You know, you might have a gardener that's working in this garden, but even that gardener doesn't really have control over the whether or not plants flourish all of the time or not. You know, it that plants themselves, they'll spread, they'll compete for sunlight, for water, for resources, and this will emerge in a way that isn't really controlled by any one feature. And so that's you know, another feature of complexity. And then in terms of non-linearity, then, you know, we might have this garden is currently, this isn't my garden, I should highlight. I mean, I'm absolutely not a gardener, but, you know, I aspire to a garden like this, is that you might have you know, a small pest invasion comes in on a plant from another country, for example, can have a devastating effect. So something quite small can have a devastating effect, and vice versa. So these are all features of complexity. And actually, as Alejandro and Bailey have said, you know, as well as Pawson, wherever this has all come from, is that realist methods are fundamentally about sort of dealing with that complexity. And we deal with that typically through considering generative causation. So the fact that we don't have you know, it's not down to just one factor, that multiple interacting factors come together to produce the outcomes that we see. That we're not just looking at outcomes, whether they're present or not, but at patterns across context, across different types of effects that can happen. And that, you know, very specifically, this is designed to think about context. And so a plant that flourishes in full sun isn't going to do so well in shade, and so on and so forth. So we could already argue that, you know, realism is designed to sort of deal with these kind of complex features and characteristics that we see in the natural and the social world. But nevertheless, there is that critique that sometimes is levelled at realist outputs. And I just want to kind of go over some of those in a little more detail. I'm just highlighting one paper here, Hind and Dixon, who have critiqued this, that realism sometimes, whilst it might be theoretically aligned to complexity, it's empirically sort of simplifying things. And I think in a way this critique is drawing on examples in the realist literature that have tended towards a simplification as opposed to looking at the body of work altogether. So if we take the idea of emergence, that outcomes cannot be reduced to individual components, well, perhaps that critique is valid if CMOs are presented as simple causal chains without recognition of multiple CMOs potentially working together, or other elements that might come into play. Go back to emergence, one of the things that is highlighted is when we're trying to interpret the results of programs or projects, for example, only thinking about the resources that the intervention might be giving, rather than thinking about the wider contextual influences that do interact with the whether or not something is successful or leading to the change that we might want to see. So this is, you know, an element within self-organization, that, you know, order arises without central control. You know, if we only think that it's the intervention alone that might be having the effects that we see, then, and we're sort of distancing context from its active role, then you can understand that that criticism might be valid. So if we think about co-evolution, where interventions and context themselves change each other over time. And I think this is where often we see results that are presented in realist evaluations in particular, that are, in a way, in order to handle the sort of sheer kind of complexity and level of detail that you might want to present, a sort of fixing and freezing time. But actually, when we think about how things do evolve and emerge in social systems, then there's often there's often sequencing and feedback loops to keep into consideration. So even if you can't present that in your findings, at least referring to that and thinking about the sequencing before and after, and how certain elements of projects might be mutually reinforcing or otherwise in your findings. And then with regards to non-linear behaviours, if we think about there being disproportionate effects and things, again, you could level that critique at realist outputs if there's inadequate attention to irregularity and as we're meant to do, like thinking about the contingency. So when does this occur, and what effect does that kind of input have? So hopefully what I'm highlighting here is not that the critiques are not valid in some instances, but actually it's probably incumbent on us as realists to, continue to focus on some of the kind of core tenets of the realist philosophy and methods in order to counter and nip any of those critiques in the bud. So what's the direction of travel in terms of the further responses to the critiques? I'm just going to give you a pen portrait here, really, of Pawson's latest thinking with regards to how do we deal with complexity. And I'm actually going to contrast that in a moment with a kind of more critical realist response. I'm not going to go into lots and lots of detail in the philosophy, but I just want you to be aware that there's not necessarily one kind of unified response, but maybe slightly different ways of handling those critiques. So Pawson, in his latest book, How to Think Like a Realist, talks about how we are, there's a sort of false dichotomy set up between open and closed systems, and that actually, in order to do any kind of scientific inquiry, we need to think about partial closure and thinking about tendencies rather than universal laws. And hopefully all of this is familiar to you. But I think the idea of partial closure is important because it suggests that certain things are within our grasp to understand it. It's not just completely open with, things moving all of the time that you can't really get a grasp of. And so how Pawson suggests we handle complexity is by, deriving and analysing configurations of CMOs or other kind of explanatory features, and being really clear about that boundary in which this is what we're trying to analyse. We're not thinking about all of that other complexity. We're just thinking about this particular part of it. And how we build up and accumulate knowledge is through multiple methods, looking at the same kind of family of mechanisms and comparing those within and across case over time, but always accepting that we will never have like a full and complete knowledge of that complex system, and nor should we attempt to. A slightly different view on this is coming from Ferdy and Denise Souza, John Eastwood in their paper in 2023, essentially leaning in a bit more to the kind of complexity and drawing on critical realism here. So highlighting and kind of making more explicit that, it is fundamentally real and is irreducible. And so they don't lean so much on putting boundaries and partial closure. They think more about understanding and doing further work to really explore the structural, relational, and those kind of deep mechanisms that are creating these complex patterns. And so they kind of suggest that, really we need to sort of focus on that kind of ontological richness and being true to complexity rather than bounding this. If anyone is in any doubt as to how Pawson feels about critical realism, then I would encourage reading of his latest book on How to Think Like a Realist, and specifically page 53, which is absolutely drawing a line under where he feels that critical realism, particularly with its view on how the world should be, is not a helpful stance from a scientific perspective. And so I think that, I think this is a slightly irreconcilable from Pawson's perspective, but at risk of alienating all of my colleagues, there is a challenge, I think, with scientific realism is that it might lead to oversimplification. And there's a challenge with critical realism approaches to this complexity regards to just being really impossible to operationalize. So that's it. I've said it. I've got no friends left, and we'll move on to potentially what should we do. So again, I'm drawing on existing literature here regards the direction of travel. So some of you may be aware of Joe and Anna's paper from 2022 regards how do we think about context, and they actually suggest it could be in two different ways. Context, which is sort of seen as more static, but they're encouraging thinking about context more as dynamic and emergent. I can draw your attention to co-evolution of complex adaptive systems thinking, which is a whole host of methods that can help us to understand the interrelationships and the dynamics between different elements of a system, and really leaning into that explicit interdisciplinary approaches. But specifically, when we're thinking about realist configurations and context mechanisms and outcomes, is to really think about them being nested. And by which I mean not just at that kind of micro level, regards the sort of reasoning in people's heads about the kind of in response to interventions, but thinking about meso and macro level mechanisms, which I'll come on and talk to it in a moment. Thinking about configurations as sequential, and again, we've seen this with Justin Jagosh ripple effects paper from a good while ago now, and thinking about it over time. Thinking about CMOs as network, so that's not just thinking about individual actors within a system, but how actors work together and what the collective response is as well as the individual response. And thinking about configurations as adaptive and changing, not just by different contexts actually, but changing over time. And there is some, bringing the two kind of author groups back together again, there is some middle ground, and I think we'll agree that it is in the middle ground of middle range abstractions. So again, just to bring you back into what do we mean by that, that's at that level of generality. So it's not so specific that it only applies to the one kind of project or program under like your scrutiny at that moment in time, but it's sort of taking a few steps back and thinking about what's generally happening here, that we can explain how things are working in certain circumstances. And a paper that actually I wasn't familiar with until pulling these slides together for this presentation, but from Ferdi and Jeff Wong around mechanism-based middle range theory. So this is where they start to collect mechanism-led theories, but put them together into bundles, which help to explain patterns at a sort of more general level. So there is potentially a way through from that point of view. So all of this really is just trying to give some context as to what's the current debates, where are people thinking around complexity, and what does that mean for our work going forward. So hopefully that's helpful context setting, because I'm now going to blow your minds further and talk about whole systems change. So this isn't where we're just thinking about the general complexity we see in perhaps projects and programs, but we're actually thinking about a program of work which in itself is attempting to work at multiple layers across multiple programs and interventions, multiple actors at the same time, in pursuit of a general improvement in societal conditions. So highly ambitious type program, but one where we have seen quite a policy shift towards in England, at least in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, particularly when trying to challenge and tackle things like what have been described in the past as wicked issues, So those might be climate change or obesity. And in our case, we're looking at physical activity inequalities. I'm going to just pause for a moment with regards to saying this is absolutely work in progress, and I come to you with humility about how we've tried to apply a realist approach within this setting, really believing in its value as an explanatory kind of method which supports local stakeholders and policymakers and practitioners to make better decisions as they're trying to do this work, but also, like really sort of finding some of the ways of which we've tried to apply that, a challenge, an ongoing challenge. And so this is absolutely a presentation of where we've got to. And I'm really interested in the questions that might come with regards to, how we've approached things, but also where we might go to next. So what this is going to cover is both is two things really. Is the co-development of a conceptual framework, and going to what Jo said in her introduction. I obviously love frameworks, but the idea of it's not within our grasp to explain absolutely everything all of the time. And if we try to do so, whilst it's technically possible, it's so overwhelming that actually it just won't be able to land in any kind of context. And so what this conceptual framework does, somehow I've got the timing going. What this conceptual framework does is really consider these are the things that we're interested in understanding in some way, shape or form, and helps us to frame what it is we're actually going to zoom in at particular moments in time. And I'm going to explain how we've used that in order to think about mechanisms that are nested at different layers of social structure, and also as they change over time. And that's going to be presented in the conceptual model and the systems maturity matrix. I'm also going to briefly introduce you to, and I won't go into loads of detail on these methods because we haven't got time, but briefly introduce you to a kind of complementary set of methods as we describe them, which looks at the development and refinement of explanatory accounts at a local level and also at a middle range level. How we've then used a technique called configurational comparative analysis, which is similar, although different, to qualitative comparative analysis, if people are aware of that. And then how we focus very much on collective sense making and learning to action. So we're working alongside the stakeholders, the actors, the policymakers, the practitioners in this work to sort of feed them with real-time evidence and insight based on that explanatory theory in order for them to put it into practice. So all of those things are probably an hour-long conversation in themselves. I'm just going to try to bring this to life for you with regards to how it works to unpack complexity in our view. So just to give you the context, Sport England is an arm's length government body in England, obviously, and they have been quite brave, in actual fact, in trying to invest very differently into local places where there's groups of people. They might be from the voluntary sector, the public sector, the sports sector, wanting to work differently to try to tackle physical activity inequalities, and wanting to work in a more aligned way. And they started off with 12 local delivery pilots. When I put the video on, I'll take this timer off. 12 pilot areas, and now they've actually invested into over 100 places. So each of these little circles here is trying to represent a different place, who are all trying to take a place-based systemic approach and transform a whole system to make it more feasible for physical activity to flourish. But given all these little different coloured wheels here, is just recognizing that the context is unique in each place. And so in each place, the intervention itself looks a little bit differently. So if I can also just draw your attention to how is this different from a normal kind of program of physical activity delivery, then in a traditional approach, people might want to fix the problem by offering services. Here's a Zumba class, just get active, no worries. Thinking about programs that are sort of short-term, discrete, they're not part of a system already, they're kind of bolted on. And very much like organizational work, working in silos, by which I mean they're just sort of on their own track and they're doing their own thing. They're not necessarily thinking about where are the linkages to other opportunities or other organizations within their geographic footprint. Whereas that place-based systemic approach, and this is where we talk about whole systems change, is rather than thinking about offering services or delivery, it's really starting from like the local area, the barriers, the characteristics of that place which enable or constrain physical activity. It's thinking about working together, collective alignment, joining up, the work of the local council together with the work of the voluntary and community sector, together with local residents themselves, and think about how can we sort of bring ourselves together to make, more than the sum of their parts. So I think I've got time, Joe, to just try and play this little video, but to do so, I will momentarily stop sharing and then share my other screen for the video, and this hopefully brings it to life even further. Actually, let me just do that again and make sure I share my sound.
We want everyone to be able to be active in ways that matter to them. And we know we need to change how we tackle inequalities to make this happen. It's no longer about one-off programs or isolated interventions. Now we're looking at the bigger picture, how whole systems and places shape people's lives. Because whether people are physically active or not depends on everything around them. Working conditions, caring responsibilities, transport, and how safe the local area is. If we're working differently, we also need to evaluate differently. Some evaluation methods try to isolate cause and effect, as if real life were a science experiment. But life isn't a lab. It's messy and complex. Things happen unexpectedly, interact and evolve. And too often, some methods can leave out the people most affected by changes. That can make inequalities worse, not better. At Sport England's National Evaluation and Learning Partnership, we support evaluation that's designed for this complexity. Not just looking at what happens, but how people are working to achieve change. Evaluation means understanding and explaining change. Local places lead the work, bringing people together, listening to communities, and shaping change in ways that reflect their local context. NELP supports them to evaluate that work in ways that are embedded, responsive, and shaped by the people living and working there. That means doing evaluation with, not to, partners and communities. Everyone is encouraged to learn as we go, listening, adapting, and improving in real time, and sharing what we've learned with others. Through this work, we're learning that every place is unique and that change happens in different ways at different speeds. But across all this diversity, we're also seeing patterns emerge across places, giving insights into how we might all work differently. As patterns emerged in places, we developed the conditions of change, a framework to capture and share learning, build collective understanding of how and why change happens, guide local efforts, and contribute to a growing bank of shared insights. For example, we're learning what it really takes to listen to communities and to share decision-making. This way of working helps us understand how and why things happen the way they do between people and organizations. As well as measurement, it brings deeper understanding, and it helps us make better decisions. When the work is complex, We need a way of evaluating that can make sense of it. This evaluation approach drives understanding of what's changing in which circumstances, as well as what's not and why. This helps us to act based on evidence and work together to support changes that really matter to local people.
So I'll just stop sharing that, and hopefully that was helpful just to give you a sense of where we are, what it is that we're trying to sort of get to grips with in this work. Am I showing my slides again?
You were, but not now. You're sharing, but not presenter mode at the moment. It's like you're sharing the window.
Oh, sorry, yes. Yeah, there we are. Are we back in the right where we should be?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully that puts into perspective the kind of type of intervention that we're looking at. And before I go on to that, I think just want to really reiterate that what that means is, and hopefully people pick this up from the animation, is that no two places are the same in terms of, you know, where they are in terms of that approach, and what they're doing specifically. So it poses lots of challenges with regards to evaluation, as you can probably imagine. I'm not expecting you to read this. What I'm trying to highlight here is that we didn't go into this piece of work with an absolutely clear-cut evaluation framework. It's something that we've had to develop and iterate and change along the way with the stakeholders who are actually doing this work as well. So it's very much a kind of shared endeavour, which is about repeated cycles of data collection, sense making and refinement, and that's both what it is we're collecting data about, as well as the refinement of our of what it is that we're interested in evaluating, and what program theories, what models we're actually trying to kind of get an understanding of. It's certainly informed by the local stakeholders, and we draw quite extensively on existing literature and theory related to whole systems change. So what that kind of really highlights is that our knowledge is developing and stretching across time, place and analytic moments. And hopefully this calls back to the kinds of call to action from Pawson around accumulating knowledge, is it's sort of an ongoing process. We're in the kind of lucky position that we're actually in a systems change program and evaluating it along the way, so we can kind of accumulate as we go. But I think there's a call to action to kind of do that and build other kind of insights in from other places as they arise as well. It's very much comparative, so we are again in a position to be able to compare across places, calling them different cases, and looking at different contexts in which this work is happening. But also, because we're involved in this over multiple years, we can compare the same place across multiple time stamps as well. So in that sense, it's longitudinal. I'm going to come on to this, but like the outcomes that that Sport England and the government are interested in achieving through this programme are actually long term, and so they're something which is as yet theorised and emergent. So what do we have to do then with regards to sort of developing our CMOs if the outcomes aren't expected to happen for a number of years in the future? And as we have been talking about already, that comparison is the engine of learning. So let me take you now through some of the conceptual frameworks that we've used to be able to kind of house and understand our models and our program theories. So the first is recognising the theory of changing complex systems, and so we're calling here on Pawson's rugby ball circle here, but actually this is also adapted from Belcher and Halliwell in terms of how they've positioned outcomes in an evaluation when things are long-term impacts that might not emerge for, you know, numerous years in the future. And the point that we want to make here is that, first of all, the outcomes associated with this programme are long-term. They are population level shifts in activity and narrowing of inequalities, and they're also of limited control. So again, thinking about complexity, we're not just thinking about the effect of the programme on those outcomes, we're also keeping in mind the myriad of other contexts which might have an effect on whether or not these things do actually come to pass or not. But what we can focus in a little bit more on, where there is a little bit more control, albeit still not complete control, is the scale and deployment of input. So by this we mean what financial resources are going in and how are decisions being made amongst those collaborative groups. And that's like the kind of inputs that are going into these systems. And then we can spend more time and more of our evaluative effort on actually understanding some of the shorter term kind of work. And this is the work that is being done within those places to actually build relationships, to develop a new way of working, and to broaden inclusion and participation. Now, just as a tangent here is that often when you see evaluations of these kind of programs, they may conclude that the program doesn't work or that the whole system change doesn't work and nothing really changed and the system snapped back to how it was. And they often say the reasons for this is because there wasn't any, you know, we didn't work collaboratively enough, or we didn't include the voices of the people with the lived experience, or we weren't able to sort of shift our processes to enable the flow of resources or decision making. And this is a common pattern that we see across places. And so thinking about Pawson's idea of middle range theories or usable conceptual platforms, you know, these are patterns that we know from the literature are likely to be the reasons why things don't work. And so early on in our approach, we said, well, actually, we'll put our evaluative effort into actually creating the conditions that mean that those later outcomes are more likely to happen. We can't theorize absolutely everything along all of that kind of causal pathway, but let's put our attention into the things that are really often the reasons why things don't work, but actually focus that as an evaluative effort. And then this may lead to, you know, more physical activity across different sectors, strengthening the community capacity to lead on local initiatives, and that collective action on structural inequalities. But again, these are outcomes that might come as a result of this initial work to actually really start to change the systems. So I think the takeaway point for me here is think about where is it within this kind of overall programme that you can actually put your evaluative effort with really sort of deep thinking and thinking about mechanisms and configurations that's actually going to be A, more likely to occur within that sort of time frame, and B, is actually going to be of use to stakeholders in order to inform their decision making going forward. The other thing that we recognise directly is that there are feedback loops and learning to action and reciprocal virtuous kind of circles, but also negative cycles that might persist along the way. So in putting our evaluative effort and our focus onto these kind of enabling conditions, we sort of drew out a sort of new conceptual framework, which was to focus people's attention onto the strategies, the ways of working, and how to actually what those relational dynamics would be between the people involved in this kind of effort. So again, I won't go into loads of detail on this, but what I want just to highlight is that within this way of working within a place, actually there's not just one perspective on what it is that people are doing. So Pawson might talk about this as with regards to like rival theories or different ways of trying to achieve the same end. And so we visualize those by like thinking about different areas of action. So are we trying to tackle physical activity inequalities by just making physical activity more visible across other sectors in health, in education, and so on and so forth? Are we tackling physical activity inequalities by really focusing on on the skills and the development of the local people to actually kind of make decisions and make changes on their own behalf? Or are we recognising that physical activity is intrinsically linked to structural inequalities and taking collective action to tackle those inequalities rather than just focusing on physical activity? And then we've really identified that actually there are certain ways of working, foundational conditions that are important for this to even be a possibility to sort of tackle those inequalities. And again, I'm not going to go into loads of detail on all of these because I want to kind of really focus in on how we then bring the realist approach back in. But hopefully some of them feel familiar to you, you know, that the workforce need to have capacity and capability to work in a different way. We need to have ways of actually communicating through our processes, not just through our people, to be able to like distribute resources and decision making. We need to collaborate. I mean, how many times have we seen collaboration in these kind of approaches? But you know, fundamentally, it's an important aspect of this work. And what I want to kind of stress here is that these conditions for change are not in and of themselves mechanisms. We're not saying these are mechanisms. What we're saying is these are ways of bucketing kind of elements of mechanisms that come together within these sort of broader headings. And they enable us to be able to kind of be a bit more agile about not getting into the weeds and the detail of every last bit of kind of realist program theory that you could think of, but to be able to kind of zoom in and zoom out with regards to how change might be happening. So let me just zoom in then on one of those conditions, which is the community-led action. So here's some program theories that are taking on two of those different approaches. So one is lived experience informs physical activity initiatives, but then we could also contrast that with the supported community-led initiatives. And if we zoom in on some of these program theories, and again, I've written them out in prose and I'm not expecting you to read it all, but we can start to see some familiar kind of concepts with regards to mechanisms. But what I wanted to highlight is that these mechanisms are not just residing at that level of individual responses. It's also recognizing that there are kind of macro level mechanisms in the institutional design, like how we might work together. Also, the meso-level mechanisms with regards to relational and collective efficacy, as well as, yeah, certainly some of those micro mechanisms around psychological engagement. And what we've done here is we're not just kind of really zooming in on just the individual response, but thinking about how there might be multi-level mechanisms operating in something such as community-led initiatives. You can also see that there's not just one CMO, there's a collection of CMOs here, and they are related to one another, they follow on from one another. So the next thing that we realized was actually, you know, again, mechanisms or conditions such as community-led initiatives is not on or off. It's something which evolves over time. And so in order to be able to understand that and that process and that change over time, we developed a system maturity matrix. Now, again, another sort of technical term there, but essentially what that is saying is that as things evolve over time and as, say, collaboration or community-led initiatives mature, there might be quantitative differences, i.e. there might be more community-level led initiatives within a place, but there might be qualitative differences as well, in the sense that initially you might have projects that are like, you know, co-owned or run by communities, but later on down the line, when the system has matured, you might have communities that are really leading on those initiatives, and that actually their voice is becoming really powerful in that local sort of governance system to decide further how the program should be how the program should be run. And so here we're talking about that adaptability. So we've got, you know, a common or a core sort of theme, as it were, but actually as it changes, that the pattern shifts as well, and we're trying to capture that in our system maturity matrix. So just bringing that to life, you know, when community-led initiatives are emerging or establishing, you know, what we've actually got here is, you know, people just recognise, no, it's good to see people working together. We need to learn skills to work differently. You know, people who've come with their enthusiasm to actually like shape how the community can be involved in things. But when this becomes more embedded, then you can really see a shift in what that means. So going from individual skills to collective skills, and the organisational growing in capacity and confidence. There's a shift in the social norms there, and like the cultural norms around physical activity being for those communities, and that's in itself appealing. That's why people come back. And then recognising that kind of community voice in those networks. So what we're highlighting here is not just a kind of theorising at a kind of individual time stamp, but thinking about how that evolves over time when things mature. And how that looks like in practice. And we work with our stakeholders to kind of, you know, to sort of see where they think they are with regards to system maturity. Is we've got a series of maturity matrices here where they can see what it looks like at different layers and different levels of maturity. And they can assess where they are, and they can assess where they might like to be. But we're not just looking at this statically, we're looking at that, how these things interact, which is the final piece that I just wanted to sort of talk you through, is thinking about how and why. So not just like illustrating that maturity does happen, but going back to that realist endeavour, is like how and why do, in this case, community-led action actually mature? How does it mature over time? So that's something that we can look at through comparison. And this is where we've used configurational comparative analysis. Now, I don't want to sort of go into loads of detail about this this method, but essentially what it is designed to do is called a set theoretic method, which means that for certain attributes within a system, you allocate them to certain sets. So that means, is something present or not present? And then you can do a particular set of analyses on the basis of that. So just a simple example here, thinking about, you know, if I'm standing outside in the rain and the outcome of that is that I'm dry, it might be because I've got a raincoat on. It might also be because I've got an umbrella. So there is like different ways in which we can actually get the same outcome of being dry. And if I was going to do an analysis on this, then I'd say, well, you know, if I've got an umbrella and a raincoat, then I'm definitely dry. If I've got an umbrella, then I'm dry. If I've got a raincoat, then I'm dry. If I've got neither, then I'm not dry. And you can start to see how you've got that kind of outcome pattern that comes out. So that's essentially what a comparative analysis does. And I'm just checking time here, so I'm not going to go into loads of detail here, Joe, but we can pick it up in the questions. But it's not the first time that qualitative comparative analysis has been suggested to be something that could run alongside a realist evaluation. And there's just some references there that you can read along lines of. But there's a big difference in how we're using this kind of method compared to previous scholars, in that previous scholars have tried to like break down CMOs into the different parts of a comparative analysis, whereas we're looking more about those conditions which I showed you earlier and seeing the extent to which these things co-occur, and that gives us general patterns which then we explore in our theorizing later. So we use our qualitative comparative analysis to give general patterns, and then we go back to our stakeholders to get the kind of realist explanatory detail. So just to bring that to life, what we do is I'm going to just draw your attention back to this kind of theory, is what we were testing. So if we want to know how and why do community-led initiatives occur within a place-based system, we might want to draw on data that are about the context. So who's involved in decision making, whether or not the voluntary and community sector is involved, as an example, how much they have control over the resources and the finances, the extent to which there are already collaborative relationships within a place, and then thinking about how the outcome of community-led initiatives might relate to those inputs. And what we found when we ran our analysis is that there isn't just one way to mature community-led initiatives. So we found that there were 4 different models that came from our cases. So one was where we had collaborative capacity in the voluntary and community sector. So the voluntary and community sector themselves were working really strongly together, and they had capacity and capability to work together, and that led to community-led initiatives. And the working theory there is that they are already in a space where they're connected with communities, they can encourage them, they can empower them, they have that sort of capacity within their systems as well. Interestingly, we saw a separate model here, was where voluntary and community sector don't necessarily have the capacity and the capability themselves, but they're very influential in decision making. And then that led to community-led initiatives appearing, or maturing, I should say. But then conversely, we saw another pattern emerging where the voluntary and community sector wasn't really present and didn't really have that kind of existing strength. But actually, within that place-based approach, people had focused on just hearing from the residents themselves, and that we had community leadership and influence that was sort of bypassing the voluntary and community sector, leading to community-led initiatives. And then a final area where work around in the background about actually developing the systems and processes for distributing money to the community sector was in itself helping for these approaches to mature. So this, just to recap, is like where we've used alongside our theorising, our realist programme theorising, we've also used another technique, comparative configurational analysis, to be able to look for these kind of macro patterns within our systems, which then draws our attention to, well, can we explain the differences between these different patterns that we've seen? And how we do that is we go back to our stakeholders and we share our findings in learning seminars, and we get them to tell us like where there are examples of this, what their explanations are, and then we can use that to refine our programme theories. So finally looking at, okay, so yes, public agencies, charitable organisations and private sector partners are working together to address physical activity, but there are different ways through that. So, and there is capacity capability within the voluntary sector, or the voluntary sector is influential in decision making, or local resident voices have influence, or work is being put into shifting underlying power, resources and governance structures. So here we're using our kind of macro patterns to try to understand micro level changes, and so on and so forth. So how it all fits together, and this is my last couple of slides, Jay, is that we have placed attention on each local place, that they are really focused on what they're doing and they evaluate that separately from us, but they share with us their understanding of how change is happening or not in these kind of realist accounts. And then what we do is we synthesize that, looking for those patterns, refining our conceptual framework and our programme theories, and also running models through the configurational comparative analysis. But that's not the end point. We don't then just report that to Sport England and say, right, fine, we've done that, that's great. We basically use that data and those findings to bring that back to our local stakeholders and say, what do you make of this? Can we explain this in any more detail? Can we refine those programme theories and think about how this actually might be emerging in your different contexts? And then that's used by the local stakeholders in their context to help them make decisions, and the pattern goes on again. So as I say, it is work in progress. I know that there's a lot of information for you to take on board in one go. but we just wanted to sort of highlight how we think that this is a way to unpack that complexity. So realist theory building across multiple nested layers, thinking about how that evolves over time using the system maturity assessments, recognizing that there might be multiple pathways to impact via configuration or comparative analysis. Really sort of paying attention to comparison across context and across time. And then importantly, sort of contextualizing and fostering use of that information via engagement with stakeholders. And I should say on the pattern that I just talked you through with community-led initiatives, one example of somebody took that away and said, okay, this is great because in our place, the voluntary and community sector is not involved in this work at all, but actually we can see that we can engage local residents and we can maybe still have the same effect that we're trying to have. Hopefully you've highlighted that this sort of treats theory as really partial, evolving, but it focuses on what Pawson was talking about with regards to being comparative. So we only really understand these patterns by looking at it across cases. And that we are very humble in the sense that we don't know if those long-term outcomes are going to come to fruition, but we're trying to learn along the way, looking at sort of shorter term outcomes and building up patterns of theories over time. I must say, ongoing challenges, the political reality of this is that Sport England would love us to be able to turn around and say, yes, this is working and it's working because of you. And here's your neat answer in half a page of A4. And the reality of, of the work they've set in train, not just our evaluation approach, is that it is quite difficult for us to meet that kind of expectation from the politicians involved. Even for an interested audience here, you can see that it's a complex set of methods and that the findings are not, don't sort of boil down into like 10 top tips and that kind of thing. They're very nuanced, they're very contextual. And so it's really critical that people engage in that for their decision making. And the best way that Kev and I have found to do that is by having conversations with them rather than like loads and loads of written reports. We do find it difficult to ensure that all stakeholders are really involved in the work, and some of it we don't have control over. But one big gap we've identified is that those experiencing the inequalities themselves, can be sidelined both in the development of the work in place and in the evaluation. And so we've got a specific kind of train of work going on at the moment, which is very much a community-led evaluation approach, which hopefully my colleague will come and present at a later date. And that, accumulating knowledge in terms of those nuanced, partial, fallible theories is an ongoing process, and we can only really touch very small amounts of like what is potentially explainable overall, but it is our endeavour to kind of build and accrue that knowledge over time. So I've gone on a little longer than I was expecting. Sorry about that, Jo, but hopefully there's still enough time for some questions.
Gosh, Katie, thank you so much. Like my head is like, I don't know, I could actually probably dominate all of the questions, but I'm not going to. Before we get to questions, come on, Realist Hub, thank you very much. Cameras on, clapping. Or you can do the whole digital clapping, or you can go old school like me and show your age, maybe. Do real clapping, but thank you so much, Katie. That was fascinating. I've got a million questions myself, but I'm just going to go back to one of your earlier slides. You don't need to sort of to put it on, but it really got me thinking, because a lot of the work that I do at the moment is around obesity, as you mentioned, is one of the complex areas of health. And one of the things I realized very early on, sitting in mental health and trying to understand the impact of medication on obesity, was actually when you thought about obesity generally, it sits in a very complex area of public health, rather than necessarily as its own like discrete part of mental health. And I don't know if you've seen the foresight map from like 2007. That blew my mind. The first conference that I went to and saw that, and I was like, oh my goodness, how on earth do we ever tackle anything when there are so many factors that actually influence whether, somebody may gain weight or may not gain weight, in addition to what may happen when you take a certain type of medication for your particular mental health condition. So that for me was just, it was interesting. And I think it's important that as realists, we step into this complexity more frequently than I think we do. I think although we talk about other areas of work being siloed, I think we can also be siloed and be very constrained in our approach. So I think that's something I would encourage people to think about a little bit more. But I was just thinking, so a lot of the people that come to the Realist Hub seminars and then come to me as well separately are PhD students or early career researchers who are very new to realist methods. And I think one of the things that they could potentially try and maybe benefit from some Katie insight, your early slides mentioned a lot about the tension between realism and critical realism in terms of simplicity and usability. Thinking of your standard doctoral project, or perhaps you've been thrown in at the deep end on a bigger, NIHR funded project, do you have any tips or guidance to help people to work out how they can resist from having oversimplified CMOCs? And we've all seen them in the literature versus something that is too complex, you can't actually work your way out of it. Do you have any sort of suggestions that you could offer the average person sitting trying to grapple with their own data currently?
Yeah, I mean, I would I think nestedness is your friend in this instance. So and this is something that I've sort of done a few times now, and from the point of view of being able to explain, be able to frame what it is you're explaining, then that's what I mean by being nested. So it's recognizing the kind of broader sort of, let's take obesity as an example, but there are obviously more simple examples, but the broader kind of structural framing for obesity being that it's highly correlated with poverty and deprivation and, these kind of things, and recognizing that as a influence on and a limitation potentially on any kind of direct intervention. But also, so essentially saying that at one level, we can explain obesity, like a very zoomed out, very meta level, we can explain obesity by X, Y, and Z. But actually, I'm focusing in on this particular element of the program or of the intervention that is, as Paulson would say, we can partially close. Yeah. And that means that you're not saying that suddenly structural inequalities like deprivation have no bearing on the on the outcome. What you're basically saying is that, but for the purpose of this study, I'm going to be looking at this particular boundary. And so I think that's a nice halfway house actually between those two things, is you're not just disregarding other influences, you're making a nod to them, you're just essentially saying, like, for this piece, what we're focusing in on. And for what I've just presented there is that obviously I've not gone into every program theory about every part of the work. I've just kind of focused in on community-led initiatives, and I've gone into a bit more detail on the explanations around that. But hopefully you can see that it sits within a framework of other conditions, and it looks different across different areas of action, and it matures over time.
Yeah.
And for this moment in time, I'm actually just going to be focusing on this bit and explaining that, but all of those other things still remain true. Yeah. They're just not the purpose of my explanation at this moment in time. Yeah. It's been really clear about what the purpose is and why.
Yeah, I mean, I can certainly relate to that, because obviously antipsychotic related weight gain is very specific, but it sits within that wider context. The people who are likely to have mental health problems, or those who live in more deprived areas, and then you're likely to potentially be on benefits, so you've got poverty to factor into the mix. But actually what you're looking at is this bit, but you can't ignore this wider influence, because it does influence it. When you talk about interestingly, we've been developing a digital booklet to be able to help people, and I've just taken that to the stakeholders this week, and there are some images in there that were deemed to be too, what would be the right word to say, too posh, I think is probably the right word.
Okay.
Which were like we can't relate to, was it avocado on toast or something? And we can't relate to this posh bath because mine is full of like, baby toys and it doesn't look nice like that. So they want things to be very much related and got absolutely nothing to do with the content that's in there. The content is fine. It's how you're framing it and an understanding of who your audience is and making sure that whatever you're developing or the findings that you're trying to articulate sit within that wider context. So it's an interesting process. Anyway, we could sit and probably talk all day. So it's probably time to move on. So I've got Faye has asked a question. Do you want to ask? On my screen, you're sitting next to each other, so you just need to turn your heads and that's it. You can talk directly to each other.
Hi, thank you. Katie, thank you for an outstanding presentation. It was so interesting. There was every second I was glued to the screen, which is highly unusual in my world. So thank you for that, first of all. I just wanted to ask you a bit about how, as the intervention matured, because I think we're all watching, thinking about our own research and our own thing because we're at the centre of our own universes. I'm looking at an intervention that has changed over time to a great extent, and I wondered what you noticed, whether that had changed sort of in a positive or negative way, those unexpected changes, and how you treated them, and just an open question about what you found, really.
Yeah, so I think in our situation, we are alongside the work. So in a way, those changes, there's two changes I'm thinking of. This is going back a few years, but one was a result of the kind of collaborative work that was unexpected and unintended, which I'll come on to. Another was an external context shift, which was COVID, which I'm sure everybody can kind of relate to if you were doing research at that time. So the first one was essentially when the first set of pilots started out doing this work, they really held onto a narrative of we're doing things differently, this is amazing, this is going to be like revolutionary, and we just need everyone to get on board and think and work differently. And predominantly those were either in the sports sort of sector or they were in public health and public sector. They weren't necessarily from the voluntary community sector. And then when they landed these brand new concepts and ideas with the voluntary sector were like, we work like this already, this is how we already work. We don't work in a kind of siloed way. We think about the whole person and we think about the context, this is how we work. And basically what happened was if you were to draw it on a kind of map in terms of enthusiasm and and collective energy for it, it just fell off a cliff in terms of the reality was that they were telling themselves they were working differently. It was just they were working differently. It wasn't that different from all of the partners that they were working with. And so that sort of then this kind of bubble that they'd created to say it meant that they had to really rethink how were they actually engaging with the different stakeholders that they're working with, come back with humility with regards to that. What are the vested interests already in the system, and how do they sort of conceive? In this instance, it wasn't even about changing the intervention per se, but it's how they talk about it, like the narrative that went alongside that. So that's just one small tiny example of how it changed over time. But from a realist point of view, if you're working alongside that, then you start to learn and understand that the language that is used and the way that this is framed is actually part of the intervention, is part of that. So then you have the opportunity to sort of start to build that into your approach and build that into your theorizing, if that's the kind of questions that you're contending with at that one time. And the second example, Faye, is when at that time, I was actually working as an evaluator for one of the pilots, and COVID landed, and a lot of the other pilots had actually set up their evaluations quite similarly to kind of like not randomized controlled trials, but like pre and post test kind of evaluation designs. And as you can imagine, COVID happens. It's a completely left field context, which meant that some people within the context were more active because they had their hour of activity and off they went for their walks. And some people in the context, particularly those living with inequalities, were less active because they were just totally restricted. There wasn't anywhere safe for them to walk, and and so on and so forth. And the people with the evaluation designs that were a bit more like pre and post test couldn't cope with this because the context was clearly entirely different than from when it started. But we were in that position where, well, we were kind of seeking to explain change as it happened, and so you just enabled us to kind of go, actually, this is a context that has shifted. To what extent now does this way of collaboratively working together hold in an entirely different context? And what we actually found is those places where they were genuinely working together were able to enable more of a kind of reactive and adaptive response to COVID, because they were already in a position where they'd built up some relationships, there were some shared goals and so on and such forth. So our evaluation was able to kind of live say, well, there's a different context here, but actually what they've been telling us is now demonstrated in another context, and is demonstrably true, that actually working together and involving people is one way of actually enabling and maintaining physical activity even in this context. So I don't know if that's actually answered your question, but it's, I think the benefit we have is that being alongside and being able to kind of evaluate in real time, that allows us to kind of be able to offer explanations according to those contextual shifts.
Have you started your evaluation yet, Faye? Even?
No, not yet. Just finishing up the review.
Looking into how you can cope with things that change, because I found when I was doing my PhD, just the very nature that I was actually having these conversations a couple of months later, they would implement the things that we'd been talking about.
Yes.
So this was like, so the environment just moves along all the time. So be aware of that. And it's interesting data that you can collect. And I would go in there and say, oh, Jo, since we saw you last, I'm sure you've seen this as well, Katie, we've been thinking, and as a team, we've had this discussion, and now we're going to do this. So if you are stuck on the whole pre-post thing, that actually can really send you into a little bit of a spiral. But if you're moving with it, it can actually, I found it fascinating to watch as it played out. Gave me really rich data as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting what you said. Sorry, Katie, what you're saying about the different conditions actually reinforcing that these things make a difference. That's it's a way of see it as another example of how you can of comparing time 1 to time 2, and the extent to which those so there's quite a lot that you can do within a case regarding comparisons and being able to test those theories over time. It is mental aerobics, I'm not going to lie, and you do need to sort of draw a boundary in the sense that what you can actually manage, as particularly if you're doing this on your own, but there's lots of opportunity there. The one thing I was going to say is really critical to that is particularly for PhD or doing that is that kind of reflexivity, and so recognizing when you are part of that intervention yourself, everything that you do may have a bearing on not just the interpretation and the results, but actually what is actually done. I'm quite comfortable with that. We see this as sort of a shared endeavour, and in the work that we do, then evaluation is almost kind of the other side of the coin to strategy and planning and that sort of thing, and it's very reciprocal. But that's because we're in that game of decision aid and support, rather than we're going to get a answer and that's going to be the definitive and then we're done and dusted. So it's a really different kind of relationship and partnership working, which is all oriented to kind of broaden out that kind of evaluative thinking. And I hope I'm not I suppose I'll just plug Kev's presentation. Is it in November, Kev, which is going to be
no, it's July. It's July.
July. July. Kev's presentation in July.
If it's November, I'm going to have a little bit of a panic because I need someone else in July.
Sorry, July. So there's just a forward plug for thinking about building evaluative thinking.
Cheers,
Faye's also mentioned that she'd love to hear more about QCA and CCA. I have a feeling that when we ran this as Not Realism, we had a webinar on QCA, but I don't have access to any of that anymore. It's all over at the Nottingham and might not even be available anymore. I'm just wondering if there's an because I think, Katie, from the information you've presented today, you could have distilled about 5 or 6 webinars down, to
No.
go into detail. If it's worth us maybe talking about bringing either you or someone else back from the team to do another webinar in the future, just focusing on something like QCA as a method to be able to deal with some realist analysis, if that's something that you might be up for. I'm putting you
Yeah.
on the spot, but it doesn't
Yeah.
have to be you. You can open it up to someone else if necessary.
Well, what I would say, Faye, is so I think I would go to the references that I've put in the slides. So David Byrne's long suggested QCA as a way of supporting realist analysis. I believe that Barbara Bafani has tried it, but sort of suggested that it needed to work at a kind of different level, which is what we've done. Whereas Dimitri Renmans in his paper has looked at, really lent into a mechanism-led kind of conceptual platform, very similar to Pawson's idea of reusable conceptual platforms, and then looked at QCA across in a synthesis and run an example of how that might work. And so his paper on ResQ is probably worth looking at. And I guess what I would say is that I think there are different approaches. I know that Jill Westhorpe has tried this and has come out on the side of difficult to allocate aspects of CMO theory to different attributes in a QCA. To me, I still feel that it has some value in helping to kind of almost organise us around what is it should we be actually looking at in a realist evaluation, rather than it being a realist evaluation itself, if that makes sense.
So we don't have any more questions, but I have one, and Kev might like to join in on this, because I think, you're right that the criticism is that the complexity informed work can be very complex. So very conceptually rich, but difficult to operationalize. And I can see that when we look at the complexity maps, because it's so vast. And I guess what I wanted to know is, do you think we're, as realists, are we getting better at operationalize how we conceptualize complexity, how we report it, and how we suggest how we can make changes within complex systems? Or do we still have a way to go with that? I probably should have given you that one to think about in advance.
No, I mean, so I'm not across the whole body of the literature, so I don't want to kind of just make sweeping generalizations, but I think the problem is recognised, and I think there's some rich methodological and ontological and epistemological work going on. I think one of the problems is publishing, in that you are forced to pass this up, make it simple, put it into packages, which may obscure the level of complexity and the level of thinking that has gone on in the work. And we experience that ourselves. So I do think there's a challenge in that. I think the other challenge that I'm hopefully going to be working with Becky on, she's gone, but was here, is and Eleanor knows this as one of my other bugbears, is where I think we are missing a trick as realists is in that accumulation of knowledge. So we're still treating each project as if it's a kind of new analysis. And I'm hoping that some people recognized some of the tenets of those conditions for change and those theories are being kind of common to multiple different examples. And I don't think we've yet nailed a method for actually accumulating and honouring those kind of similar patterns, which isn't necessarily helping us deal with complexity per se, but it means that those kind of broader challenges of every individual scholar trying to position their work in this big complex field may be lessened, because you could start to point to, say, Eleanor's work has covered this part of it and Faye's work has covered that part of it and I'm covering this part of it, and we're thinking about how those things connect. And I think that's also a way in which we could deal with some of the policy kind of critiques of realist evaluation, is that it doesn't give them an overall answer. Well, it doesn't, because we're trying to analyse small parts of it. But actually, if we had a good way of accumulating across projects and building up these, these kind of like middle range pictures, as it were, then that might give us a little bit more of that conceptual architecture through which we can actually start to, to kind of package it up a little bit more.
Yeah, I think it sometimes can be difficult to understand and realize the long-term effects of the project, and not only like how they go along their own trajectory, but how the related projects then combine. And it could be related projects that you were doing, but it could also be related projects across a wider body, tapping into other people's. I don't know, in my head, one of the things I was just spiking off there when you were thinking is one way of approaching this, and I'm literally making this up as I speak, is one way of approaching this when you start a synthesis, for example, is exploring what other syntheses, like realist syntheses, already exist on this topic, and can we start there with developing our IPTs from that base, and then use that base to then go forward, because then otherwise you risk identifying exactly the same literature as several other syntheses have already identified. And I realize there are nuances, and I can critique my own thing in my head.
Just to cut. So I have we've got an example in progress at the moment where 2 separate teams did a realist synthesis on pretty much the same question, but in not knowing of each other's work. So so that's given us an opportunity to actually think of what is the method through which we stitch these together, because they cover some of the same ground, but not exactly the same ground, and their interpretation is similar but different. So that was what I was kind of highlighting, that Becky and I are going to try and revisit that and bring that to light, and that would be another seminar that I'll do for you in the future.
Definitely, because for me it's always, why are we reinventing the wheel? Why are we forgetting the work that previous scholars have already done, whether it's actually realist or whether it's a systematic or a narrative review? We can use that as a starting point rather than a blank canvas as if nothing has existed. Kev, I don't know if you want to come in. We are at past, so I'm happy if anyone wants to go, but it's been a very interesting debate.
I think Katie's summarised it. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that there is sometimes a bit of a pressure, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, to simplify things, which is obviously at odds with what we're trying to do. So therefore, the key thing is, how do you make this type of work accessible without undermining the ontological foundations of where we're coming from with this work? So that's a key drive for what we're trying to do, but that's only can be done through those relational dynamics of bringing people with you. So that would be my thought.
Yeah, agree. Very much on the whole, like, knowledge mobilization, how you're going to bring them with you as you do that and disseminate it and embed it. But yeah, fantastic. So many things. Katie, I could talk to you all day.
I know. Maybe not. You shouldn't let me loose though, because I could talk all day as well. So
well, then people would just be like, that's the people in the corner, just go and ignore them.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Jo, and thanks for the audience and the questions.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. See you next time.